I now look to Elliot Bromley, Standing Committee, St Edmund Hall, to close the case for the proposition.
Thank you, Mr. President. Before I begin, I'd like to say what an honour it is to speak in this august chamber alongside such prestigious individuals, and beyond that, to debate a motion that is not about the political party by which you align yourself today, but instead about freedom, choice, and human values. For the purpose of my speech, I will conceive of the working class of the 1980s in a Marxist sense, recognised by one's relationship to the means of production, the proletariat. I've chosen to interpret the working class in this light, given the polarising nature of society at this time, alongside the attachment to the production process. However, I will argue that Thatcher was heroic in her abolition of socialist classes, that by the end of the 1980s, the working class of the socialist years soon became associated with aspiration and liberation. I deem it important at this point to note that when Thatcher entered politics, there was a very clear working class. And by the time of her exit in 1990, the socio-economic makeup was unrecognisable. The collective had been replaced by the individual. There's no such thing as society. There are individual men and women, and there are families. Thatcher had reinstalled confidence, responsibility, and belief. Baroness Thatcher set out to do two things. Firstly, to free the people from the constraints of socialism, and secondly, to destroy privileges of the old ruling class. There is no doubt that Thatcher managed to sweep aside the old class barriers that had kept people in their place, and for that, she is hated and loved. Yet I must take this opportunity to reverse the question. And should the motion have been, this House believes Thatcher was an enemy of the upper class, would there have even been debate? Today I want to make it clear that Thatcher not only fought the socialism of the left, but also of the right, the National Socialism or even fascism. Both sides had mutual and curtailing fear of the market, partnered with a profound love of the state. Thatcher's privatisation spread wealth and ownership, of which the upper-class Tory grandees firmly opposed. When British Steel was privatised, 94% of workers bought shares. When National Power was privatised, 99% of workers bought shares. It wasn't long before share ownership became more common than trade union membership. Privatisation didn't just change ownership, it changed attitudes. Hard work paid, productivity rates rocketed. Some industries struggled to survive, but Britain was back in business. The left was shaken by members of the so-called working class, taking advantage of Thatcherite reforms. It's as if they resented the social mobility. Thatcher had torn down old class barriers. It's not in our interest this evening to say that Thatcher ought to have been considered a hero by the working class, but in fact that she was. I will argue that Thatcher was indeed a hero for the working class in three ways. Firstly, I will argue exactly why Thatcher was a hero for the working class, opposed to other like-minded visionaries of the time. Secondly, I will argue that Thatcher proved a hero for the working class in abolishing the restricting class boundary that had been defined through socialist thought. And finally, I will briefly argue that Thatcher was heroic for the working class for a lasting legacy of confirmation. Whilst the DT defined a hero through comparison to the likes of Rosa Parks, and incredibly ironically, our president, I see it beneficial to consider why Thatcher and not like-minded visionaries. Yes, Thatcher became Prime Minister, but the reasons are beyond that as to why Thatcher herself is explicitly a hero for the working class. The steady decline of the nation in the 1970s was seen as a responsibility of the system, with individuals avoiding the blame. During this period, there were several like-minded visionaries, be it Enoch Powell as the apostle of the free market or von Hayek. However, Thatcher was the hero, given her tenacity and execution. Thatcher had the honesty and the courage to say what wasn't a proper industry and what was make-believe. Nationalisation was said to bring prosperity, but instead brought decline. Whilst it would be incorrect to suggest that Thatcher provided a silver bullet for the nation, she never shied away from the fact of the matter. Initial devastation of communities that lost jobs overnight, from mining to steel, with no immediate alternative. However, Thatcher stated that this would benefit the nation in the long term. Britain was the sick man of Europe. Someone had to take the medicine. In the 1960s, people had no other template for government improvement. Thatcher came with ideas and put them into practice. Thatcher was exceptional. Not only did Thatcher carry values which were shared and appreciated by the working class of the time, but she also took on the upper class Tories, the Wets, the sort of people who didn't have to buy their own furniture, and the very notion of consensus politics following post-war Britain. Thatcher's shared working class values are broadly detailed as individual self-enrichment and enterprise and instinctive hostility to collective action. Thatcher argued that such values were critical in that we want a society where people are free to make choices, to make mistakes, to be generous and compassionate. This is what we mean by a moral society, not a society where the state is responsible for everything and no one is responsible for the state. Whilst there's debate, as we've heard this evening, over whether Thatcher herself was of the working class, I argue that regardless of Thatcher's class, she remained a hero for the working class, given her relatability to the aforementioned values. Thatcher encountered social prejudice and snobbery at Oxford, although rather ironically found her home at Alca, and soon came to understand that capitalism replaces status with rank and hierarchy, which the upper class were not happy with, a meritocracy whereby one's efforts would be rewarded. This brings me to my second argument. Was it the reform of trade union power, the rescue of the economy from apparent terminal decline, or the release of industry from state ownership? All of these, technically, could be reversed, but it would be humanly impossible to overturn the revolution in social attitudes that Thatcher brought about. It is often argued that old industries were the beating hearts of the communities they sustained. Whilst the unions provided a sense of belonging and pride, it was a false power, a shared experience of containment, of limitation and control. To each his own pigeonhole, from each total conformity. Although in theory it looked to liberate workers, it had in fact done the complete opposite. Thatcher threw off the chains of socialism. Thatcher saw the answer as freedom, not conservatism. Whilst it may be criticised for being paternalistic, when people are free to choose, they choose freedom. If Thatcher had one aim, it was to stop us thinking in terms of class. It groups people as bundles and sets them against one another. The idea that people could better their lives by collective action rather than by individual self-improvement had seen its own failure. To my final point, the great discovery of the modern right only had to happen once to have multi-generational implications. Whilst Thatcher may be far from a hero for today's working class, however you choose to define it, one must avoid conflating society today with that of the 1970s. Whilst Thatcher's initial shift was transformational, the policies and values that remain today continue to be a benefit for many. Much of the working class entered the 1970s living in rented accommodation, working for the state, and left school at the first opportunity. I urge you to consider your parents, your grandparents. Have they progressed in life? Are you in a better position than they were at your age? Please take a moment to appreciate not only the reward for hard work, but more so the opportunity. Don't accept the world as it is, dream of what the world could be, and then help make it happen. No, these are not the words of Baroness Thatcher, but instead of Peter Tatchell, speaking on the opposition this evening. However, Thatcher did exactly that. Whilst Mr. Tatchell may be dreaming of a world gone by, Thatcher was progressive, seeking a new world bound by freedom. Whilst it would typically make sense to consider a balance of harms at this point, in this case, it is clear that had Thatcher not led the country, and I quote, "to cure the British disease with socialism was like trying to cure leukemia with leeches." Thatcher was a heroic revolutionary. She was not about privilege. She was not about helping the upper class. She was about liberation. When Baroness Thatcher's coffin passed through Westminster in April 2013, it was not the tears of Etonians and aristocrats flowing, but instead those of the ordinary people, People who had finally been awarded the right to aspire to a greater and more meaningful life. To oppose tonight's motion would be to undermine freedom, opportunity, and ambition. I urge you to look beyond your preconceptions this evening and support the motion that stands before the House. Thank you.